If you would like to follow along, if you turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 4, this is not going to be an exposition of Romans 4 verses 1 through 8, but rather want to use this to set the stage for what we're going to be looking at as we examine the life of another one of these men who influenced the writings of Edwards, although maybe it's questionable whether he influenced Edwards or Edwards saw in him the same thing that he was seeing and used him because of his stature to buttress what he was doing at that particular time. At any rate, we do want to learn something of the life of Thomas Shepard, and as it's already been pointed out this evening, the thing that stands out about him as we study his character is his humility, the fact that he is humbled over his sins. Let me read Romans 4 verses 1 through 8 as we begin. The Apostle Paul writes to the church at Rome, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account." I think the one thing we're going to see as we get to the character of Thomas Shepard is the fact that he did not in any way boast in his works. He realized the very best of his works fell far short of the glory of God. And so his hope, his entire hope of salvation, was in Jesus Christ alone. Now, as I've said, this evening we're going to be looking at least the last of those experimental divines, if we can put it that way, those who believed Christianity was not just a set of beliefs to embrace, but rather it's a life to experience, a life to be lived for the glory of God. The last person we're going to look at in this regard, who influenced Edwards and his particular views of the marks of saving grace, is Thomas Shepard. I mentioned earlier that B.B. Warfield, who was one of the great scholars at Princeton around the turn of the 18th, 19th century, well, not 18th century, but 19th century, as we move from the 1800s into the, make that 20th century. He did live in the late 1800s, and I believe he made it into the early 1900s. Warfield noted Edwards' familiarity with Shepard. It appears that Shepard's influence on Edwards was primarily in the area that we are considering, which is the marks of grace. As a matter of fact, David Coffin, I don't know if you, it's a great last name to have, isn't it, Coffin, but who prepared the final chapter of John Gerstner's Rational Biblical Theology of Jonathan Edwards, entitled A Select Bibliography of Jonathan Edwards' Reading. He made a catalog of different books that he either possessed or wanted to possess and read. He analyzes what Edwards had in there, and he notes that Shepard's works were quoted frequently by Edwards in the religious affections. He writes that, quote, "In religious affections, Jonathan Edwards quoted more from Shepard than any other author, calling him that famous experimental divine." There's really only one place that Edwards quotes Shepard outside of the affections, and that is in Miscellany 676, that also deals with this subject, and I think it's worth noting. Edwards writes this, the topic is sin. He says, "All that a natural man does is sin." See Shepard's Sincere Convert, page 105. "Let a woman seek to give all the content to her husband that may be, not out of any love to him, but only out of love to another man. He abhors all that she does." So again, the idea being here that even though an unconverted man may do everything that God requires of him, yet if he does it out of love not for God, but for something else or someone else, it means nothing to him. And that's all that an unconverted person can do. So again, it deals with the marks of saving grace, but again, it wasn't included in the affections. Now, Gerstner, in his introduction to the Sola Deo Gloria reprint of Shepard's Parable of the Ten Virgins, and by the way, as we go through these different authors, I want you to realize we have several of them in the library. And if you want to know precisely which ones we have and which ones we don't, you'll have to talk to BJ. He's the one who went through our library yesterday and cataloged and added all the new books. And I think we did add 2 volumes of Shepard's works. I don't think we added 3 because I think one of them was out of print. Maybe if he'll shake his head on this. Do we have the Parable of the Ten Virgins? Okay, we do have that. Anyway, Gerstner writes in the introduction to the Sola Deo Gloria reprint of that book, Jonathan Edwards quoted from the parable in his classic Religious Affections more often than all the other secondary writings combined. This may have been because Shepard was the profoundest of all, the most biblical of all, or the most cryptic of all. It could even have been because he was the most difficult of all to understand. Certainly, that was because his parable was the most unfinished of all, being published from rough sermon notes he left behind. And that's one thing you have to bear in mind when you're reading the parable, is that he did not prepare that for publication. But friends, after his death, and he died at a very early age, I think he was only 44 years old, took his sermon notes and published them, I think, pretty much as they were. And we'll see more about that when we read what Alexander White had to say about him. I think a more plausible reason why Edwards quoted Shepard so frequently is not because he was cryptic or hard to understand, but, as I said before, support from someone like Shepard of his stature and influence would help in what the Religious Affections was all about, which was trying to show that the Great Awakening really was a work of God, and it wasn't something that was produced by the flesh. It wasn't something that was produced by the devil. The devil would not promote the work of God's kingdom. He would do everything he could to destroy it. And even though Satan was at work in the Great Awakening trying to stop it, that work was a work of God, as proved by the effect it had on people's lives. It produced religious affections. So again, it may not be so much that Shepard was influential on Edwards, as rather Edwards found him to be an ally that would make his work perhaps more credible. Now this evening we're going to consider a brief sketch of the life and character of Thomas Shepard. Even though brief, it's still going to take a few minutes to get through it. But again, by understanding something of the man, I think we'll be better prepared to receive what he has to tell us. If we might say, here's Thomas Shepard. He was a Puritan minister who lived in the 17th century. I think I got it right that time. Listen to what he has to say. We're not going to listen as well unless we know something about the man and something of his character. And I think also that as we see his life, as it unfolds in these few words that we're going to be looking about him, it also provides an example of a man who was converted and what differences conversion makes in our lives, or what difference it should make, not the least of which is humility over our sins. So by seeing something of what he thought of himself, and we're going to see, I think, a good deal of that, it will help us to understand as well. And sometimes I think we get this impression when we read the Puritans and they expound the Christian life, what a Christian is supposed to be, and you see all the detail and how high the standard is. Sometimes you tend to think the Puritans believed that they had actually reached that standard and were looking down at the rest of us saying, you should come up here where I am. That's not what they were doing. I think Shepard probably indicted himself more than anyone else, realized what he was in the sight of the Lord. He was just simply trying to be faithful. Even though he didn't reach that standard, he still wanted to lift that standard up to where it is, so that he might strive to attain for it, that it might convict him, that he might repent of his sins, as well as the rest of us. So he's not speaking or writing condescendingly, but I think out of a deep interest to do himself and others good. Well, first of all, let's consider a sketch of his life and his works, and this is taken from the History of Cambridge by Abiel Holmes, who had Master of Arts. And basically, most of this material comes out of that. If you looked at the notes, you'll see where I drew from other sources, but I'm not going to distinguish which comes from one or the other. So let's just take a look, first of all, at a sketch of his life. He writes, the Reverend Thomas Shepard was born in Towcester, near Northampton in Great Britain, November the 5th, 1605. He was the son of Mr. William Shepard, who called him Thomas, because his birth was supposed to be at the very hour when the gunpowder treason was designed to be perpetrated. I had to look up some of these events because I had no idea what the gunpowder treason was, but this is what it is. A failed attempt by a group of provincial English Catholics to kill King James I of England, his family, and most of the Protestant aristocracy in a single attack by blowing up the House of Parliament during the state opening on November the 5th, 1605. Now that came from another source, and just so happens that's the very day in which Thomas Shepard was born. Now he says a plot, okay, this was the gunpowder treason, concerning which he observed, that is the father, William Shepard, this child of his would hardly believe that ever such wickedness could be attempted by the sons of men. His devout mother died when he was 4, and he lived a difficult life under his stepmother. His father died when he reached 10, at which point he lived with his grandparents and later an older brother, whom he held in high and grateful regard. A schoolmaster ignited in him a scholarly interest which ultimately led to entry into Emmanuel College in Cambridge University at the age of 15. Now again, going to the university at such a young age was not so unusual. Edwards went at 13. You basically go from grammar school after you learn those essential things that you need, and you go into college earlier, probably because most people expected to live to be about 30, and that was it. So you better get going if you're going to do anything significant. Okay, so here, that is at Emmanuel College at Cambridge, after a residence of about 2 years, he was impressed with very powerful convictions of his misery in unregeneracy, which, though occasionally suspended, were effectually renewed through the instrumentality of that celebrated divine Dr. Preston in 1624. Robert Preston, I believe it is, who, let's see, we have some of his works, I think, in the library on prayer, and I think the Breastplate of Faith and Love. I think he was a contemporary with William Shakespeare, as a matter of fact. Well, maybe not Shakespeare, but I think he ministered in the same place that Shakespeare had once been. From this time, he gave himself to daily meditation, which he attended every evening before supper. He accounts in his autobiography that he lived a dissatisfied and dissolute life, which led him to pray out in a nearby field, at which point he underwent the beginnings of a conversion experience. Having graduated with a Master of Arts at Cambridge, he accepted an invitation to Earl's Colne, Essex, in 1627, where he held a lecture supported by the pious charity of Dr. Wilson for 3 years. There, God greatly blessed his labors, and many souls were converted by his ministry. Now, of course, when that happens, persecution arises, because at that time, the nonconformity, although more prominent, I think, later in that century, was also at hand there if you didn't take orders. And perhaps at that time, most of the men did, but to preach the gospel didn't seem to be allowed, and there was a bishop that was appointed to persecute them, Archbishop Laud. At the close of this term, the inhabitants of Earl's Colne were so reluctant to part with him that they raised a salary amongst themselves for his support and prevailed on him to continue with them. Although he was yet a young man, there was an unusual majesty and energy in his preaching and a holiness in his life which rendered him eminently useful to his own people and to the towns in the vicinity, from which several afterwards accompanied him to New England to enjoy the benefit of his ministry. When Dr. Laud became Bishop of London, Mr. Shepard was silenced for his Puritanism. Being invited into Yorkshire, he officiated there for some time as a private chaplain in the family of Sir Richard Darley, whose near kinswoman he afterwards married. To that family and neighborhood he appears to have been a great blessing, Bishop Neale refusing him liberty for his ministry without subscription. He removed to Heddon in Northumberland, where his labors were very successful. But the zeal of the bishop reached him, even in this remote corner of the kingdom, and prohibited him from preaching here anymore. So there we see something of the reason of the difficulty. He was not willing to subscribe to that order of the Church of England and to take holy orders with them. Now, the removal of Mr. Cotton, Mr. Hooker, Mr. Stone, and others to America had already excited many pious people in various parts of England to contemplate a similar removal. Several of Mr. Shepard's friends in New England and others who purposed removal uniting their solicitations at this juncture, he resolved to repair to this new plantation. Having accordingly preached his farewell sermon at Newcastle, he went in disguise to Ipswich, and thence to Earl's Colne, whence, accompanied by Mr. Norton, he went to Yarmouth, intending to embark there for New England. I think Yarmouth was where Flavel was ministering. Whether that, I forget exactly whether the years overlap, it's quite possible, or it could be that Shepard was before that time. Officials, however, were employed to apprehend him. These messengers, these pursuers, having discovered Mr. Shepard's quarters, had, by a sum of money, obtained a promise from a boy belonging to the house where he lodged, to open the door for them at a certain hour of the night. But by the singular providence of God, the design was frustrated. Some serious expressions of Mr. Shepard being uttered in the hearing of this boy, he was struck with horror at the thought that he should be so wicked as to betray so good a man, and with tears discovered the whole plot to his pious master, who took care immediately to convey Mr. Shepard out of the reach of his enemies. Toward the close of the year 1634, Mr. Shepard embarked at Harwich, which in a few hours the ship was driven back into Yarmouth Road, where arose one of the most tremendous storms ever known. The ship was almost miraculously saved, but so materially damaged that the proposed voyage was relinquished. Mr. Shepard, after spending the winter at Bastwick, went in the spring to London, where, by a removal of his lodgings, he again narrowly escaped his pursuers. In July, he sailed from Gravesend, and on the 3rd of October, 1635, following the death of his eldest son, after a hazardous voyage, he arrived at Boston. His friends at Newtown, or Cambridge, soon conducted him to that infant settlement destined to be the field of his future labors. His wife died thereafter, as did his second wife and other children. Shepard was regarded as one of the foremost Puritan ministers of his day, esteemed in the company of individuals like Richard Mather and John Cotton. He took special interest in Puritan ministry to the Massachusetts Native Americans. Today, a plaque at Harvard University, in the words of Cotton Mather, records that it was in consideration of the salutary effect of Shepard's ministry that the college ultimately came to be placed in Newtown, known today as Cambridge, Massachusetts. It is interesting. I knew that Shepard was instrumental in the founding of Harvard, but didn't know exactly what his influence was. Apparently it was his preaching and his ministry there, and I think also something of his influence trying to get the college established there. And here's another interesting tidbit. 3 of Shepard's sons followed him into the ministry: Thomas Shepard II, Samuel Shepard, and Jeremiah Shepard. Thomas Shepard II was an ancestor of U.S. Presidents John Quincy Adams and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They come from good stock. And it shows us how the Lord's blessing seems to attend down that lineage when you have one who was very faithful to the Lord. After a diligent, laborious, and successful ministry, he died of the quinsy, August the 25th, 1649, which is a peritonsillar abscess, which is a complication of tonsillitis, at the age of 44. On his deathbed, he said to the young ministers around him, quote, that their work was great and called for great seriousness, and mentioned to them 3 things concerning himself: that the study of every sermon cost him tears, that before he preached any sermon he got good by it himself, and that he always went into the pulpit as if he were to give up his accounts to his master. He is said to have been a poor, weak, pale-complexioned man. He was distinguished for his humility and piety, and as a preacher of evangelical truth and an author of experimental religion, he was one of the foremost of his day. He was an influential patron of learning as well as of religion, and was zealous in promoting the interests of the infant college as well as those of the infant church at Cambridge. By his death, not only the church and people at Cambridge, but also all New England sustained a very great loss. He not only preached the gospel profitably and successfully, but also left behind him diverse worthy works of special use, in reference unto the clearing up the state of the soul toward God, which is, again, the reason why Edwards focused upon his writings. He wrote a good deal about it. Now, in this biography of Shepard, the author tells us what those works are, and perhaps by going through some of these things, you get an overview of the things you can expect to find in Shepard. He says this: Mr. Shepard's printed works are Theses Sabbaticae, in which he has handled the morality of the Sabbath with a degree of reason, reading, and religion, which is truly extraordinary. I believe that was a quote from Cotton Mather. Theses Sabbaticae is basically a book about the Sabbath, and he gives several theses regarding the day and how we ought to observe it. Having just gone through it, in the morning, you'll see that we just did it, just brushing the surface. He goes into it very deeply. Do we have that work? I forget. That may be the one that's not. I think that's the title of one of the 3 volumes. So is the other one The Sincere Convert and Sound Believer? Then if we have those, we have everything that Edwards quoted from. A discourse in which is handled the controversy of the Catholic visible church, tending to clear up the old way of Christ in the churches of New England. A letter on the church membership of children and their right to baptism. This letter was printed at Cambridge, 1663. A letter entitled New England's Lamentation for Old England's Errors. A sermon entitled Cautions Against Spiritual Drunkenness. A treatise entitled Subjection to Christ in All His Ordinances and Appointments, the Best Means to Preserve Our Liberty, to which is subjoined another treatise concerning ineffectual hearing of the Word. The Sincere Convert, which the author called his ragged child on account of its incorrectness, it having been surreptitiously published, or published without, I think, the proper authority or his being involved in it. The Sound Believer, which is a discriminating treatise on evangelical conversion. The Parable of the 10 Virgins, a posthumous work in folio transcribed from his sermons, preached at his lecture from June 1636 to May of 1640. I wonder if that's all he preached during that time. That would be, well, it'd be nearly, 4 years of sermons from that one parable, which is not unheard of in Puritan circles. Let's see. Concerning which the venerable divines Greenhill, Calamy, Ash, and Taylor observed, quote, that though a vein of serious, solid, and hearty piety run through all this author's works, yet he has reserved the best wine till the last, close quote. Singing of Psalms, a gospel ordinance, which in the title page is said to be by John Cotton, teacher of the church at Boston in New England, but which was really in substance the work of Mr. Shepard. On a blank leaf of the copy now before me, there is the following memorandum, probably written by the Reverend Thomas Shepard of Charleston, whose name is on the book. It says, Mr. Edward Bulkley, pastor of the Church of Christ in Concord, told me September 20th, 1674, that when he boarded at Mr. Cotton's house at the first coming forth of this book of Singing of Psalms, Mr. Cotton told him that my father Shepard had the chief hand in the composing of it, and therefore Mr. Cotton said, I am troubled that my brother Shepard's name is not prefixed to it. Close quote. It is a quarto of 72 pages and was printed at London in 1647. Perhaps this shows us something of Shepard's humility, that he was willing to attribute the work to Cotton rather than to himself, to give him that credit rather than take it to himself. The Clear Sunshine of the Gospel upon the Indians, published in London, 1648. Neal mentions a work of Mr. Shepard entitled Evangelical Call as one of his most noted treatises. I find no notice of it elsewhere. And Select Cases Resolved, First Principles of the Oracles of God or Some of Christian Religion, Meditations and Spiritual Experiences extracted from Mr. Shepard's private diary. These 3 were published by the Reverend Mr. Prince of Boston, the last of them from the original manuscript in 1747. The Select Cases and First Principles were published together first at London and then at Edinburgh in 1648 and have since passed through several editions. Not too long ago, Sola Deo Gloria did reprint the works of Thomas Shepard. When we stocked up the library, I was able to find 2 of the volumes were still in print, and those have already been mentioned, but one of them still isn't, so we may not have some of these works in the library. So that basically gives you a sketch of his life and a sketch of his works, but there is more. There is basically a sketch of his character by Alexander White, who was an influential Scottish Presbyterian of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And this is what he writes, and I think here we get to see a little bit more of the character. And by the way, Alexander White, I think this may be the first that I've read of him, is very witty in his prose, or his style of writing. I think you will enjoy this. He says, "Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest of the sons of men, has given us his appreciation of Thomas Shepard in a most eloquent and impressive way. I know no such complete and conclusive appreciation in all literature as when Jonathan Edwards on every page underbuilds and establishes and illustrates his spiritual masterpiece, the religious affections, with constant references to the 10 virgins, the sound convert, and the spiritual experiences, and with no less than innumerable quotations from those so experimental Puritan books. I know no instance of the principle he is praised by one who is praised, at all to compare with that of Thomas Shepard and Jonathan Edwards. Now, though I cannot speak with an atom of the authority of Edwards, at the same time I am not, on that account, wholly shut out from making my own humble acknowledgement of what I also owe to this great Pilgrim Father. I am not debarred from laying my own loyal tribute at the feet of the man on whose head Jonathan Edwards has set such a crown. Thomas Shepard has been one of my favorite authors ever since the year 1861, when my honored friend Dr. Williamson of Huntley wrote my name on his own copy of the Parable of the 10 Virgins. I think I must have read Shepard quite as often as Spurgeon had read Bunyan, quite as often at any rate as Jowett had read Boswell. And I am still reading Shepard as if I had never read him before. As a proof of that, take this little confidence of mine. The week before one of my holidays, I had read Professor Churton Collins' delightful paper on The Tempest, which is a play written by William Shakespeare, that had appeared some time previously in the Contemporary Review. And so impressed was I with the learned professor's paper that I took to the country with me Dr. Furness's Variorum, which means a text that contains the notes of various scholars or editors on a particular work. So he says, I took to the country with me Dr. Furness's Variorum and monumental edition of that exquisite work, that is The Tempest, promising myself a great revel over the great text and over the extraordinary rich mass of explanatory and illustrative notes. But would you believe it? With such a temptation lying on my table all the time, I never once opened the seductive volume. For as God would have it, as John Bunyan was wont to say, or apt to say, I had taken Thomas Shepard also with me, and I read the 10 Virgins, and the Sound Believer, and the Sincere Convert, and the Saint's Jewel, and the Select Cases, and the Spiritual Experiences over and over again, appalling English and all. And instead of repenting myself for my neglect of Shakespeare and his monumental editor, I came home thanking God again for his so notable and so exceptional servant Shepard. And more than that, I came home more settled and resolved than ever to do all I can to make you know something of Shepard's matchlessly pungent lessons in spiritual and experimental religion. And to reassure me, I took out of my desk and read again a postcard bearing the Aberdeen postmark, which I received some years ago and which runs thus: 1,000 thanks for pressing Thomas Shepard on our attention. After long looking for it, I have at last got a copy of the parable, and I can scarcely lay it down. It is proving itself a very book of life to me. This is the preaching that our day needs. A Free Church Minister. That was the signature, Free Church Minister. I dare say you will remember that I was always besieging you to buy and to read all your days, as also to distribute the Pilgrim's Progress and the Grace Abounding. But you will have perfect peace of mind concerning Thomas Shepard and his works, for I shall never ask any of you to spend 1 penny on Shepard. Such is his atrocious English. Bunyan and Shepard are at one in the deepest things, but they stand at opposite poles in the matter of their English style. Shepard, at his very best, wrote an all but unrecognizable English. But after the New England printers and then the Aberdeen printers had put Shepard's best book through their hands, if hands they could be called, Shepard came forth absolutely unreadable. unless to a few resolved and relentless and irresistible readers, such as Mrs. Black of Dunaker Manse and Dr. Foote of Brechin and Dr. Williamson and myself. Much as I respect William Greenhill's judgment, who was a Puritan minister and one of the members of the Westminster Assembly, I cannot follow him when he says of Shepard that here is a cornfield without cockle or thorns or thistles. I know quite well what Greenhill means when he says all that, and I wholly subscribe to his deep meaning. But if I were to repeat his words without some warning, you might be led into advertising for the old book, which you would no sooner open than you would throw it down in disgust and in indignation, both at Shepard and at Greenhill and at me. Polybius, who was an ancient Greek historian, says Dr. Butcher pays the penalty attaching to neglect of form. He is read by few. At the same time, I will say this. As we find Principal Randall quite frankly acknowledging the heavy, cramped vocabulary and the deadness of expression and the formless monotony of clause that all combine to weigh down the first book of Marcus Aurelius, while at the same time he stands up against Matthew Arnold when the critic says that the emperor's style lacks distinction and physiognomy, which basically means a good general appearance, so will I stand up for Shepard's distinction and for his physiognomy. The truth is, while repeating and exaggerating all the Stoic emperor's faults of style, Shepard's mental countenance is even more unmistakable to me than is that of the royal author of the immortal Thoughts or Meditations. There is no possibility of our ever mistaking a page or a paragraph or even a sentence of Thomas Shepard's, not only because of its unparalleled shapelessness, but much more because of its Paul-like hands and feet. For Shepard, once he has got on your track, will follow hard after you all your days. And once he gets a real hold of you, as Luther said of Paul, you will never be able to shake him off again. But when all is said that can be said about Shepard's sluggard's garden of a style, if you will go with me into the resolved study of this great Puritan, I will promise you many a sweet and fragrant flower out of his crannied and crumbling walls, and many a medicinal herb out of his stoniest places, and many a cup of wine well refined out of his most gnarled or crabbed vine stalks. Just gird up your loins and come with me and see if it will not be so. And as the saintly David Brainerd says, we shall see what passed for soul-saving religion with that so excellent and so venerable Pilgrim Father, Thomas Shepard, the author of the Sound Convert, the Spiritual Experiences, and the Parable Unfolded. Take these, then, as some specimen and characteristic headings, sometimes of short entries and sometimes of whole chapters in Shepard's Spiritual Experiences. Now, these are just headings of chapters or sections, not the whole thing. So these are the headings. No one who ever came under my shadow prospered. The more I do, the worse I am. My idle words in my preaching, in my praise, and in my prayer. The sins of one day I forget the next day. I come to see that God is having his whole name in Exodus 34 fulfilled and adorned in me. And by the way, the passage it's referring to is this: Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. So he says basically, I come to see that God is having his whole name in Exodus 34 fulfilled and adorned in me. For his sake I am killed all the day long. I keep a private fast for the conquest of my pride. My sins are sometimes crucified, but they are never mortified. I am salted with suffering. I abhor myself. You ask me what cured me of being an infidel. Some remorses of an old ministry. Surely I have always laid my pipe far short of the fountain, and so on throughout the whole unique book. Now I will appeal to all readers of the best literature to say if they ever came upon more penetrating and more pungent titles and topics than these. At any rate, the immortal author of the freedom of the will and the true virtue and the religious affections never did, that is Jonathan Edwards, and his splendid appreciation of Thomas Shepard runs accordingly. When matters were not going well with Shepard himself in his family life, In his pain and remorse, he would sometimes say that he thought the Pope had the right way of it with his preachers and pastors. At any rate, he would sometimes say, "I wish I had remained a celibate along with my own soul all my days." Other men, he was apt to say, might always manage their family life with the most perfect success, but a minister's breakdown at home was to Shepard the greatest of all domestic tragedies. He had known many ministers, both in Old England and in New England, whose family life was a great success in every way, but not his own. As for himself, neither wife, nor child, nor servant, nor visitor prospered spiritually under his baleful shadow. So he enters it again and again on occasions in his secret journal, which he kept alone with God. Nobody but himself thought such things about Thomas Shepard. All the same, never was there more sincerity or more poignancy in any private journal than there was in his. Thales was so fond of children that nothing would persuade him to become a father. And though Thomas Shepard became the father of more children than one, he both loved and pitied his children so much that he would sometimes wish that they had never been born, at any rate to him. Now again, notice this is his estimation of himself, not others. And that shows something, I think, of his great humility. Altogether, substitute Thomas Shepard, the New England Puritan, for Santa Teresa, the Spanish superior, and you will have his exact case in his home life as he so often saw and felt it to be. Thomas Shepard could not express himself nearly so well as Santa Teresa could, but in substance and in essence they both said exactly the same thing. "My children," said the saint on her deathbed, "you must pardon me much. You must pardon me most of all the bad example I have given you. Do not imitate me. Do not live as I have lived. I have been the greatest sinner in all Spain. I have not kept the laws that I have laid down for other people. But then, is not this written in David expressly for me? The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and a contrite heart God will not despise." Now this next section, we have to wonder, I don't think that Alexander White, who was a good Scottish Presbyterian, was putting his endorsement on all Roman Catholicism, but he certainly seems to with regard to Santa Teresa. Thomas Shepard and Teresa of Jesus would not have spoken to one another on earth, but they are now praising God together in glory. And for their family shame, they are now having the double as they sing together before the throne and say, "By thy great grace to us, O God, here are we ourselves and all the children that thou didst give us." So again, it may be in this particular case he believed her to be converted. If so, remember, it was in spite of the Roman Catholic Church, not because of her doctrine. As you know, they've anathematized the gospel. When Dr. Chalmers was out at Skirling on one occasion, he went to the village school and gave the children an elementary lesson in optical science. Taking the blackboard and a piece of chalk, he drew a long diameter on the board, I suppose that would mean a straight line, and then ran a large circumference around the diameter, so something like this, okay? He says, and in like manner, okay, and then turning to the wondering children, he said to them in his own imaginative and eloquent way, "You must all see that the longer the diameter of light, the larger is the surrounding circumference of darkness. And in like manner, the shorter the diameter of light, the smaller is the circumference of the surrounding darkness." Now, all we have to do in order to explain and illustrate one of Thomas Shepard's most startling self-accusations is to carry over Dr. Chalmers' mathematical and optical blackboard into the region of moral and spiritual things. "The more I do," says Shepard oftener than once, "the worse I am." That is to say, the longer the diameter of Shepard's duty done, the larger is the circumference of duty he has still to do. And the holier and holier his heart and life become, the more sinful the remaining corruption of his heart and life becomes to him, till he is constrained to cry out with the holiest of men, "O wretched man that I am." And then, carrying up all his own experience of the spiritual life therewith to deepen and strengthen and enrich his pulpit work, the great preacher would say, "There is no difference. I am as you are, and you are as I am. Just try the thing yourselves. Just begin to love God with all your heart, and you will soon see that the more you try to do, that the less will you feel satisfied that you succeed. And in like manner, when you begin to love your neighbor as yourself, you will begin to get a lesson with a vengeance in the spiritual life. Just try to rejoice in all your neighbor's well-being as much as you rejoice in your own. Just try to relish and enjoy all other men's praises of your neighbor as you relish and enjoy all other men's praises of yourself. Just try to take delight in all your neighbor's rewards, promotions, prosperities, as you take delight in your own. And go on trying to do that toward all men around you, friend and foe, and you will get a lesson in the infinite and exquisite holiness and spirituality of God's law of love, and at the same time a lesson in the abominable and unspeakable corruptions of your own heart that will make you wiser in all these matters than all your teachers. Sounds very eye-opening, doesn't it? Very penetrating. In such homecoming homiletic as that, Shepard made pulpit and pastoral application of his own experiences in the spiritual life, till he became a foremost master in all these holy matters, until men like Edwards and Brainerd sat as his scholars at his feet in New England, until his name became a tower of truth and power in the old England from which he had been exiled. Well, that's the end of what Alexander White has to say about Shepard, but I don't know about you, but it does tend to sort of whet my appetite for what Shepard has to say. Sounds like he was somebody who knew his heart very well. And again, the Puritans believed that there were only two books that you really needed to learn in order to be a great preacher. That is the book of God, the Bible, and then the book of your own hearts. And if you know both of those very well, it was said you would never run out of material to preach. So this is the man whose writings we're going to be looking at. We are going to be surveying, I believe, mainly the work of the parable of the 10 virgins. But we're also going to bring in, where it sort of overlaps, material from other works of Shepard as well, the sincere convert and the sound believer mainly. But at least this evening, as Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, we see in Shepard's life examples that we can follow, examples of serving the Lord under persecution, examples of not thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. And I think we see another great example. Remember, the Apostle Paul says it's a trustworthy saying deserving full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, among whom I am foremost of all. He wrote that in one of his last writings at the end of his life before he was martyred for Christ's cause. And even when he had reached, the very apex of what we would consider, his sanctification, he believed himself to be the greatest sinner of all. Again, using Dr. Chalmers' illustration, the more I try to serve Christ, the more I become aware of the things that I'm not doing. As John Frame once said, the more I understand, the more I know, as my circle of knowledge expands, I become more aware of what I don't know than believing that I have everything cinched up now, that I have all this knowledge. The more we learn, the more we realize how ignorant we are. The more we try to grow in holiness, the more we realize how corrupt we are. And we see that in Paul's life, and we see that in Thomas Shepard's life. So I think Shepard has a lot to tell us, and we'll begin to look at his writings next time. But for now, let's just think about this example and some of the things we've been taught, meditate on them for a few moments, and ask the Lord to apply these to our hearts.